Behind the gilded gates and marble corridors of Britain's most prestigious palaces lies a truth that no royal biography dares to whisper. For centuries, the monarchy has been built on an image of unwavering composure, divine right, and moral superiority. But what happens when that carefully constructed facade begins to crack? What secrets hide behind the ceremonial robes and jewelled crowns? Tonight, we're pulling back the velvet curtains on 30 British royals whose private struggles were far more complex than their public personas ever revealed. These weren't scandals that made headlines or gossip that filled drawing rooms. These were quiet dependencies, hidden compulsions, and secret rituals that shaped the very foundation of the British crown. From medieval kings who couldn't sleep without their mysterious elixirs, to modern princes whose medicine cabinets told stories their press secretaries never dared to share. We're about to explore the shadow side of royalty, the side where divine right met human weakness, where absolute power couldn't conquer personal demons, and where the weight of the crown became too heavy to bear without help. Before we begin this journey through royal secrets, take a moment to settle in, perhaps dim the lights, find your most comfortable position, and prepare yourself for revelations that have been buried in palace archives for generations. And while you're here, let us know where in the world you're listening from. Are you drifting off to sleep in London, staying up late in New York, or somewhere in between? Drop a comment and tell us what time it is where you are. This isn't just a story about addiction. It's a story about the impossible burden of perfection, the crushing weight of expectation, and the very human need to find relief from a life lived entirely in the spotlight. Because when you're born into a role that demands you never show weakness, never admit struggle, and never appear anything less than divine, where do you turn when the pressure becomes unbearable? Our first royal understood this burden all too well. King George IV wasn't just the flamboyant Prince Regent known for his architectural vanity projects and expanding waistlines. He was a man quietly unravelling under the weight of a daily chemical contract that would make a modern addiction specialist pale with concern. George wasn't addicted to power or grandeur, though he certainly enjoyed both. He was addicted to the substances that made him feel capable of wielding that power. Chief among these was laudanum, the 19th century's answer to everything that ailed the human spirit. Toothache, melancholy, heartbreak, gout, existential dread, the crushing boredom of court life. Laudanum promised relief from it all. But George didn't approach this miracle cure with the cautious respect of his subjects. He consumed it like a man who had forgotten where the line between medicine and dependency was supposed to be drawn. His relationship with alcohol was equally complex. Wine, brandy, punch, gin, if it could numb either his physical pain or his psychological torment, George embraced it with the enthusiasm of a man drowning who had just been thrown a rope. His personal wine cellar required its own staff, not because he was a connoisseur, but because his consumption had become its own full-time occupation. What makes George's story particularly haunting isn't just the scale of his dependency, but how thoroughly it was hidden behind a mirror-polished image. Official portraits showed him as a romantic figure of royal strength, despite the reality that he had ballooned to over 20 stone and couldn't climb stairs without assistance. Court painters literally airbrushed his deteriorating condition into historical fiction. Public appearances were choreographed with military precision, kept brief and often supplemented with carefully worded statements about minor ailments and necessary rest. One physician, in a letter that wasn't meant for public consumption, described the king's liver as resembling a small turkey and his digestive system as fundamentally unfit for governing an empire. The psychological roots of George's spiral remain a subject of historical debate. Some point to his disastrous political marriage to Caroline of Brunswick, a union that felt more like diplomatic hostage-taking than romantic partnership. Others cite the death of his beloved daughter, Princess Charlotte, as the turning point when grief became too heavy to carry without chemical assistance. Or Palace insiders who later broke their silence described managing George's condition as a constant balancing act. Mood swings followed by hours of trembling silence. Physicians administering additional tonics to counteract the effects of previous medications, creating feedback loops of dependence that grew stronger with each passing year. It was the royal version of showing up hungover to your own life, day after day, decade after decade. Yet somehow, the public never quite saw the full picture. George IV was marketed as a symbol of stability and national grandeur, even as he stumbled through his final years, both literally and metaphorically. When he died, newspapers reported his passing with the reverence reserved for gods. No mention of the bottles, the pills, the quiet collapses behind silk curtains. The myth of royal invincibility endured, clean and untouchable. But George wasn't alone in this carefully managed deception. His great-grandson would inherit not just the throne, but a remarkably similar relationship with substances that promised relief from the unbearable weight of royal expectation. King Edward VII brought his own unique approach to managing the impossible demands of monarchy. If George IV masked his addictions behind velvet and portraiture, Edward VII camouflaged his dependencies with charm. The kind of irresistible charisma that made people forget to look too closely at what you were doing with your other hand, where your money was going, or exactly how many cigars you had consumed before breakfast. Edward spent 6 decades as the Prince of Wales, effectively waiting for his mother, Queen Victoria, to die. She didn't cooperate with his timeline, leaving him with too much time, too much money, and far too few meaningful responsibilities. This combination proved catastrophic for a man with an already compulsive personality and access to unlimited resources. His 2 great weaknesses were gambling and tobacco, though calling them weaknesses hardly captures the scale of his involvement. Edward reportedly smoked 12 to 20 cigars daily, not including his cigarette breaks. Court records describe cigars being imported, cut, and stored according to his exact specifications, treated with the same reverence other royals reserved for crown jewels. These cigars became his companions in meetings, carriages, meals, and eventually on his deathbed. They were also his armor, a constant assertion of control in a world where he controlled almost nothing else. Certainly not his mother's political decisions, or the constitutional limitations that kept him perpetually waiting in the wings. Gambling provided a different kind of escape, less constant, but far more explosive in its consequences. Edward wasn't a cautious bettor. He lost enormous sums in Parisian casinos, Monte Carlo backrooms, and aristocratic drawing rooms across Europe. One of his most notorious losses involved a private baccarat game that became a full-blown scandal when details leaked to the press. British newspapers delicately danced around the specifics, using phrases like unseemly conduct and inappropriate associations. But the truth, revealed by biographers decades later, was that Edward's presence had violated every protocol of royal neutrality while compromising friends and lending royal credibility to activities that would have landed ordinary citizens in prison. Yet somehow, none of this damaged his public image. Edward possessed what society politely called a hearty appetite for life, which served as elegant code for someone who overindulged in everything while maintaining the good sense to tip generously. His vices became amusing anecdotes rather than serious concerns, testament to either his exceptional public relations skills or his friends' remarkable loyalty in keeping secrets. Behind the scenes, palace staff worked frantically to manage the practical consequences of his habits. Private letters reveal mild panic about public appearances, mostly due to the smoke that clung to his clothes and the gambling debts that arrived regularly in the mail. One royal servant complained that his cigars had invaded every fabric in the palace, from drapes to diplomatic correspondence, but no one dared confront him directly. By the time Edward finally ascended to the throne at age 59, he was already wheezing from decades of tobacco abuse. His 9-year reign was marked by diplomatic success, but his body bore the unmistakable signs of his private battles. Even so, He maintained his image as the grand conciliator, a king who understood both courts and casinos, who could charm any room before the smoke cleared. His addictions were never officially acknowledged, but they surfaced eventually in memoirs and court gossip. They never quite managed to tarnish his legacy, because Edward had mastered something his predecessors had not. He made vice look like sophisticated leisure, transforming personal weakness into public charm. But the pattern didn't end with Edward's death. His son would bring yet another variation to the theme of royal dependency, one that was quieter, more methodical, and ultimately just as destructive. King George V approached his dependencies with the methodical precision of a naval officer executing orders. Where his father Edward had smoked with theatrical flair, George consumed cigarettes like a man fulfilling a sacred duty. Up to 20 a day, sometimes more, not as recreation but as a tool he relied on to navigate the treacherous waters of 20th century monarchy. This wasn't the casual smoking of a social butterfly, or the rebellious gesture of a young prince testing boundaries. George's relationship with tobacco was clinical, almost ritualistic. In his personal correspondence, there are glimpses of a man who lit cigarettes not to celebrate, but to endure. Endure meetings with increasingly demanding prime ministers. Endure the suffocating silence of state ceremonies. Endure the unbearable weight of presiding over an empire that was slowly, inexorably falling apart. Unlike his father's flamboyant displays of excess, George's dependence was internalized, systematic, deeply habitual. Photographs from the era show his fingers positioned in that familiar gesture even when no cigarette is visible, as if his body had memorized the ritual long before his mind consciously reached for relief. Court physicians noticed the pattern, as did his household staff, but the public remained blissfully unaware. Early 20th century royal publicity was a carefully orchestrated machine, and King George V was marketed as the embodiment of unwavering stability. Newspapers praised his austere virtue and iron discipline, even as royal doctors quietly managed his worsening bronchitis, emphysema, and chronic throat inflammation. When illness threatened to topple the king, as it did repeatedly throughout the 1920s and 30s, official statements spoke of minor ailments and brief recoveries. Meanwhile, George was receiving oxygen treatments behind palace doors, struggling with laboured breathing, and being injected with stimulants just to remain upright during state functions. According to diaries later released by royal staff, his morning routine began with tea, a cigarette, and profound silence. A kind of secular communion for a monarch who outwardly controlled everything but privately controlled nothing. He ruled over a collapsing empire, a family torn apart by revolution and exile, and subjects who were rapidly losing patience with crowns and ceremony. His addiction wasn't flamboyant rebellion or scandalous secret. It was quiet collapse, a daily compromise with reality. One more cigarette to survive one more briefing, one more appearance, one more moment of pretending that everything remained under control. When George died in 1936, his passing was officially attributed to lung complications, though the exact circumstances were carefully edited for public consumption. His physician famously administered a final injection of morphine and cocaine, not to save the king, but to ensure he died punctually for the morning newspapers. Even in death, the performance mattered more than the person. The man who had inhaled his way through 2 world wars and imperial dissolution had to exit on schedule, with dignity, and preferably without coughing. His addiction was never acknowledged by the monarchy, but the evidence lingered in every yellowed fingertip, every rasping breath, every hollowed lung that told the true story of his reign. His legacy became one of steadfast duty and unwavering service, but those who looked closely could see the real cost of that carefully maintained image in every exhale, every pause between words, every moment when the king's composure flickered just enough to reveal the man beneath the crown. George's son would inherit more than just the throne. The anxious, stammering George VI would also inherit his father's reliance on smoke and spirits. Only this time, the anxiety wasn't just inherited. It was visible, audible, and eventually fatal. In the pantheon of reluctant monarchs, George VI stands tragically alone, remembered not for his natural gifts but for the visible, almost painful effort required to perform royalty at all. History celebrates him as the stammering king who found his voice just in time to rally a nation through its darkest hour. But behind that heroic narrative was a man so consumed by anxiety that he turned to two faithful companions he could always depend on for relief. Alcohol and cigarettes weren't indulgences for George. They were medical necessities. From childhood, he had been the overlooked spare, the second son with uncertain speech raised in the towering shadow of his charismatic older brother Edward. No one, including George himself, expected him to wear the crown. When Edward abdicated in 1936 to marry Wallis Simpson, George was thrust into a role he never wanted and arguably never should have inherited. He coped the only way he knew how, through rigid ritual, careful restraint, and quietly escalating dependence on substances that dulled the sharp edges of royal responsibility. The cigarette habit began early and intensified with alarming speed. By his 30s, George was consuming more than a pack daily. By his 40s, that number had doubled. His staff, loyal to the royal script of perfection, filtered his public image with surgical precision, never showing the ashtrays that followed him from room to room, or the nervous pacing that preceded major speeches. Photographs were selected to conceal how thin he had grown, how grey his complexion had become, how sunken his eyes appeared during state functions. If monarchy was performance, George VI was a stagehand who never escaped the spotlight, always acting, never comfortable, perpetually aware of his own inadequacy. Then there was the drinking. Unlike his predecessors who consumed alcohol with ceremony or celebration, George drank quietly, consistently, with increasing frequency as the pressures mounted. His preferred spirit was gin, though he wasn't particularly selective. Alcohol served as social lubrication, helping him navigate the unbearable stiffness of court protocol and somehow survive the speeches that terrified him more than any enemy bombardment. Former staff members later recalled how he would take a measured drink before radio broadcasts, then chain smoke through his recovery from the ordeal. This wasn't about pleasure or even relaxation. It was pure survival, chemical assistance for a man trying to fulfill a role that seemed designed to destroy him. Royal physicians noticed his deteriorating condition, naturally, but they approached the subject with characteristic delicacy, offering euphemisms and half measures instead of honest medical intervention. His health began failing in the 1940s, but public statements insisted he was recovering, resting, engaged in light duties. The truth painted a much starker picture of a man slowly suffocating under combined pressure from expectation and the poisons he used to meet those expectations. In 1951, he underwent surgery for lung cancer, though the word cancer was never officially uttered in public statements. The operation removed part of his left lung, but George resumed his duties almost immediately, wrapped in scarves, flanked by concerned staff, smiling through obvious pain. That same year, he appeared at London's airport to bid farewell to his daughter Elizabeth, who was departing on what would become a defining royal tour. It was the last time father and daughter would see each other. George died in his sleep in 1952 at the age of 56, a king worn down by war, anxiety, and decades of carefully managed self-medication. The official cause was coronary thrombosis, medical language that politely avoided mentioning a body systematically poisoned by stress, tobacco, and the profound silence that surrounded his suffering. The nation mourned a beloved, steady monarch, but few understood the true cost of that steadiness. He had inherited a throne he never desired, endured a voice that betrayed him at every crucial moment, and turned to quiet chemical companions to bridge the impossible gap between duty and humanity. In death as in life, the mask of royal dignity remained perfectly intact, concealing the man who had needed help just to breathe, just to speak, just to survive another day wearing a crown that never quite fit. Yet even in death, George's mask of dignity couldn't fully conceal the truth that would echo through the generations. Because just across the palace corridors, another royal was already discovering her own path to quiet chemical comfort. The Queen Mother, with her pearls as permanent as her composure, and a handbag that seemed to carry nothing but royal decorum, was crafting a dependency so elegant it would be mistaken for aristocratic charm for over half a century. She was the smiling matriarch who refused to flee London during the Blitz, waving from palace windows like a porcelain figurine untouched by fear or doubt. To the world, Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, embodied British resilience, the woman who outlived nearly everyone she'd ever known, with a grin that seemed almost supernatural in its persistence. But behind that carefully maintained facade of gin and smiles was a quieter truth that polite society was never meant to acknowledge. She drank, not scandalously or ruinously, but with the kind of refined consistency that transforms habit into ritual. Her beverage of choice was a specific concoction, gin and dubonnet in equal parts, garnished with 2 slices of lemon with the rind carefully preserved. This wasn't some hastily mixed cocktail, grabbed during moments of stress. It was a precisely calibrated elixir, mixed by palace staff multiple times throughout each day, reportedly beginning before lunch and continuing well into the evening hours. This represented no raucous party girl narrative. This was British aristocracy's version of controlled release, elegant and refined, never publicly discussed. The key lay in that silence. For decades, the Queen Mother's drinking was folded seamlessly into the broader mythology of her indomitable spirit. Her fondness for refreshment was treated with the kind of affectionate euphemism reserved for beloved relatives. Her daily tipple, a little something to maintain her energy. Biographers writing during her lifetime approached the subject with surgical delicacy, as if revealing too much might somehow destabilize the national equilibrium. But palace insiders told a more nuanced story. Former staff members, speaking only after retirement and always with careful phrasing, noted that her days were punctuated by alcohol, with the same regularity others might schedule afternoon tea. One former footman remarked that the drinks tray appeared as reliably as the schedule for walking the royal corgis. Another attendant, quoted anonymously years later, described the palace as operating on ritual, and cocktails formed an integral part of that sacred routine. Still, no one ever suggested she was out of control. That wasn't the point of her story. Her relationship with alcohol was quiet, measured, and in its own sophisticated way, inevitable. This wasn't excess in any classical sense. It was endurance, a way of managing the unbearable weight of expectation that came with being the last living link to an empire that no longer existed. The Queen Mother had survived 2 world wars, her husband's death, the abdication crisis that nearly destroyed the monarchy, and the gradual dismantling of everything she had been raised to believe was permanent. Throughout all of it, she had maintained perfect posture, kept her hats tilted at precisely the right angle, sustained that famous smile through decades of upheaval. If that performance required a few glasses of fortified spirits before dinner, well, that remained strictly her business, and the business of absolutely no one else. What proves most fascinating and perhaps unsettling is how thoroughly this dependency became normalized within the royal ecosystem. It never generated headlines or sparked concerned interventions. The royal publicity machine had already cast her as utterly untouchable. The Queen Mother, the last empress, the nation's beloved grandmother. In that carefully constructed version of reality, gin wasn't a crutch or a weakness. It was simply another charming character detail, like her fondness for pastel colours or her legendary stubbornness about modern technology. But the habit remained real, and so did its quiet influence over her daily rhythms. while her public image stayed pristine and untouchable. Her daughter, Princess Margaret, would not enjoy the same luxury of concealment. Where the Queen Mother's drinking was wrapped in nostalgia and respectability, Margaret's would be draped in scandal, cigarette smoke, and the slow unravelling of a woman desperately trying to outrun her own carefully constructed legend. If the Queen Mother drifted through royal life on a cloud of debonair and discretion, Princess Margaret crashed through it with a martini in one hand and a cigarette permanently attached to the other. Or at least that's how the tabloid newspapers chose to frame her story. She embodied everything her sister Queen Elizabeth II was not: glamorous, defiant, impulsive, deeply emotional, magnetically unpredictable. But beneath the shimmering surface of tiaras and Caribbean getaways was a woman quietly coming apart under the weight of the very stage she had been born onto. Her addictions to alcohol, cigarettes, prescription medications, and perhaps most destructively, to being constantly observed and admired, were less hidden than simply tolerated by a system that had grown comfortable with her controlled chaos. Until suddenly they weren't tolerable anymore. Margaret occupied the impossible position of younger sister, the spare heir, a role she seemed to simultaneously resent and embrace with equal fervour. Her entire life unfolded in the gilded echo chamber of her sister's destiny. She would never wear the crown, but she would always remain undeniably royal. She played this contradictory role with unmistakable flair, smoking in public when ladies simply didn't smoke, dancing in nightclubs, when royals maintained dignified distance, wearing crimson nail polish, during an era when red signified open rebellion. She transformed routine state events into something resembling high-fashion editorials that had accidentally wandered into Westminster Abbey. By all contemporary accounts, she was magnetically charismatic, but that magnetism extracted a steep price. The relentless expectation to perform, coupled with equally relentless scrutiny when she inevitably faltered, created an impossible psychological trap. Margaret's dependence on alcohol didn't begin with dramatic collapse or public humiliation. It started with ritual, the same way most royal addictions quietly took root: a whiskey before lunch, wine accompanying meals, port or brandy afterward. Over time, those social rituals hardened into inflexible routine, and that routine gradually assumed control over her daily existence. Friends and former staff members later recalled how her legendary sharp wit would slowly fade as each day progressed, replaced by slurred speech, icy mood swings, and extended periods of impenetrable silence. What had once been Margaret simply being Margaret gradually transformed into something far more tragic. Margaret disappearing inside herself, one glass at a time. Her cigarette consumption proved equally relentless and far more visible to public observation. She reportedly smoked up to 60 cigarettes daily for decades, a staggering amount that would challenge even the most dedicated nicotine addicts. When the pressures of royal obligations mounted, or when elaborate parties ended and guests departed, leaving her alone with her thoughts, there were always pills available to smooth the transition between artificial highs and crushing lows. Sedatives, tranquilizers, sleeping aids, all perfectly legal, all properly prescribed, all seamlessly integrated into the performance of being Princess Margaret. The palace initially tried to maintain appearances, as it always did. For years, Margaret's drinking was dismissed as charming eccentricity, her smoking as a generational quirk that would eventually resolve itself. The public witnessed the laughter, the lavish holidays, the scandalous romances that kept tabloid editors in business for decades. They never saw the private collapses behind closed doors, the missed appointments that had to be quietly rescheduled, the days spent confined to bed with curtains drawn against a world that demanded constant sparkle and perpetual availability. Even after suffering a series of strokes during the 1990s, official language remained diplomatically vague. Health complications, mobility issues, the need for extended rest. Few public statements mentioned the long history of physical deterioration that had become impossible to ignore by anyone paying close attention. When Margaret died in 2002 at age 71, she appeared far older than her chronological years, visibly diminished from the rebellious sparkle that had once defined her public persona. Her legacy remains beautifully complicated, a woman simultaneously trapped and defined by her royal title, who burned brilliantly, lived dangerously, and ultimately faced her final years largely alone. But her story wasn't unique within the long sweep of royal history, not even remotely close. Because nearly 400 years earlier, another monarch, far more powerful and infinitely more feared, had also lost himself to compulsive consumption. Not cocktails and tabloid scandals, but medieval feasts and primitive opiates wrapped in myths of absolute majesty that made his eventual downfall appear even more monstrous. Long before Buckingham Palace employed press secretaries, before the House of Windsor mastered the delicate art of damage control, and before addiction became something quietly managed behind velvet curtains, there ruled Henry VIII. A monarch who required no concealment because his absolute power made objective truth entirely optional. He remains England's most infamous king, a force of nature who acquired 6 wives, maintained an appetite for supreme authority, and developed a waistline that expanded in direct proportion to his political control. Publicly, he represented strength incarnate, divine right made flesh. Privately, he was a man whose body was systematically breaking down, kept functional only through compulsive eating, wine-soaked excess, and early forms of pain relief that modern medicine would immediately recognize as narcotic dependence. In his youth, Henry had been genuinely athletic, magnetically charismatic, a Renaissance poster child who wielded jousting lances with the same confidence he applied to Latin scholarship. But by middle age, he had transformed into something far more troubling. Morbidly obese, barely mobile, suffering from a catalogue of health problems that reads like a medical textbook. Chronic leg ulcers that festered and stank, persistent insomnia, debilitating gout, mood swings so extreme they made court attendance a daily gamble with potential execution. To manage this cascade of physical and psychological agony, Henry relied on what his court physicians diplomatically termed soothing tonics. These weren't gentle herbal teas or harmless folk remedies. They were crude but effective precursors to modern opiates, tinctures derived from poppy plants, extracts of mandrake root, even experimental compounds laced with mercury that promised relief from suffering while slowly poisoning the patient. These substances dulled the excruciating pain in his legs, which had turned septic and developed such a horrific odour that even loyal courtiers struggled to remain in his presence during private audiences. They helped regulate his erratic sleep patterns, calmed his increasingly paranoid rages, and provided temporary escape from the mounting pressures of ruling an empire while inhabiting a body that was actively rebelling against his authority. Food became another form of medication, elaborate feasts that functioned as therapeutic rituals rather than mere sustenance. Tables literally buckled under the weight of pies, roasted meats, and sweet wines, as if culinary abundance could somehow smother the reality of physical decay and psychological torment. His official portraits, famously idealized by court painters who understood the consequences of honest representation, show a king towering in armor, resolute and commanding. The truth proved far less flattering and infinitely more human. By the 1540s, Henry required mechanical assistance to lift his massive body into bed each night, yet no one dared speak openly of dependence or addiction. Such concepts didn't exist in 16th century vocabulary, especially not when applied to kings who ruled by divine appointment. If Henry demanded wine with breakfast and opium-laced cordials with dinner, these requests were treated not as evidence of weakness, but as royal prerogative. Even his personal physicians, who privately documented his worsening condition in coded language, couched their observations in careful euphemism. The king requires his tincture for proper rest, His Majesty finds the cordial beneficial for his humours. It represented loyalty through strategic omission, medical care filtered through political necessity. Modern historians, poring over surviving court records and medical documentation, have slowly reconstructed what no one dared name during Henry's lifetime. The king was essentially medicating himself into basic functionality, using the primitive pharmaceuticals available in his era to maintain some semblance of royal authority, while his body and mind gradually deteriorated. His legendary volatility, the sudden executions, the explosive rages, the seemingly random religious reversals that reshaped English society, these may have been less divine inspiration and more chemical fluctuation. A monarch simultaneously enabled and eroded by the very substances meant to preserve his ability to govern, and yet, even as his physical form failed him catastrophically, the myth endured with remarkable resilience. Royal power insulated him from scrutiny, and historical time polished his reputation into something approaching legend. The bloated, medicated, pain-ridden man became, in collective memory, a colossus in armour, a titan who reshaped England through sheer force of will. But Henry wasn't the only monarch to weaponize contradiction so effectively. Just a century later, another king would publicly condemn a particular vice from religious pulpits, while quietly indulging that same weakness in private, until the boundary between moral crusade and personal hypocrisy vanished entirely in clouds of aromatic smoke. In 1604, King James I published what would become the most scathing anti-smoking manifesto of the early modern era. A counterblast to tobacco wasn't merely criticism, it was literary warfare, describing the habit as loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the lungs. The rhetoric was so fierce, so morally absolute, that it left no doubt about where this particular monarch stood on the creeping threat of tobacco consumption. And yet, as so often happens in the shadowed corridors of royal life, the official story was considerably more complicated than the published proclamation suggested. While James may have penned history's most famous anti-smoking treatise, evidence suggests his relationship with tobacco was far more nuanced than his public condemnation indicated. In his younger years, long before England's throne had been handed to him like an unwanted inheritance, James VI of Scotland moved through court circles where smoking was not just tolerated, but actively encouraged as sophisticated social ritual. Tobacco, then an expensive luxury imported from Spanish and Portuguese colonies, was offered in ornate pipes during elite gatherings, treated as both medicine and exotic indulgence. Early correspondence from Scottish courtiers hints at a young James who participated with apparent enthusiasm during social functions, especially throughout the 1580s, when tobacco retained its mystique as a fashionable novelty among European aristocracy. Later in life, once he had inherited the crowns of both Scotland and England, James underwent what can only be described as a complete philosophical transformation. The anti-tobacco essay formed part of a broader campaign to establish himself as the moral shepherd of his subjects, a ruler who stood above vice, above hypocrisy, and certainly above the growing trend of smoky tavern indulgences that were, in his reformed view, corrupting the moral fabric of society. The published text itself reads like theatrical performance, drawing elaborate comparisons between tobacco smoke and what he memorably described as the horrible stink of hell itself. Yet within court walls, the king's actual relationship with the substance remained far less definitive than his public rhetoric suggested. Several historians believe his aggressive anti-tobacco stance originated not from pure moral principle, but from personal frustration, possibly rooted in his own early experimentation with smoking. While no direct evidence confirms James as a lifelong smoker, multiple contemporary sources, including Spanish diplomatic correspondence and French court gossip, refer obliquely to habits abandoned in youth. One particularly revealing account from a visiting ambassador suggested the king's frequent condemnation of smoking seemed rehearsed, as if designed to convince himself as much as his audience. The intensity of his public opposition, some observers noted, felt disproportionate to the actual threat tobacco posed to his kingdom. Whether James was truly addicted or merely experimented and recoiled in horror remains historically unclear. But what seems certain is that he spent much of his reign policing not just his subjects' behaviour, but his own carefully constructed image. His fierce anti-smoking campaign conveniently aligned with his economic interests, allowing him to impose heavy taxes on imported tobacco while simultaneously condemning its use. This represented royal sleight of hand at its most sophisticated, policy that appeared virtuous but functioned primarily as revenue generation. What makes James's story resonate across centuries isn't whether he smoked in secret or simply flirted with the habit in youth. It's that his need to publicly disavow tobacco so loudly, so aggressively, and in such elaborate published form reveals the profound tension between private self and performative monarchy. This same tension would echo through the centuries in another royal figure, one who faced the devastating losses of war and personal tragedy, not with public speeches or moral campaigns, but with gentle sedatives that helped steady trembling hands while the world praised her as Britain's last great queen. Queen Anne understood suffering in ways that most monarchs mercifully never experience. She was never accused of sentimentality or emotional display, her public image ironed flat into the rigid silhouette of early 18th century protocol. Cold, composed, endlessly dignified. She was the woman who corrected grammar mid-conversation, catalogued royal porcelain by historical period, and once instructed a fainting lady-in-waiting to stand still and think like a duchess when composure seemed to be failing. But beneath that unwavering exterior were cracks that ran deeper than any public ceremony could conceal. And into those fractures crept something the nation never witnessed: a quiet reliance on alcohol that helped her survive the two most psychologically devastating chapters of her reign, the War of Spanish Succession and the crushing weight of personal loss that would have broken a less determined spirit. It's difficult to overstate the psychological toll that early 18th century politics inflicted on the monarchy. Queen Anne wasn't just a symbol of imperial endurance, she was expected to embody that endurance while simultaneously grieving losses that would have destroyed ordinary people. She lost 17 children through miscarriages, stillbirths, and early deaths. That isn't a statistic to be noted and forgotten. It represents persistent trauma compounded by chronic physical ailments that left her barely able to walk in her final years. She suffered from debilitating gout and what court physicians vaguely labelled as dropsy, a term encompassing everything from heart failure to severe edema that left her swollen and in constant pain. Yet through all of this, she was expected to appear regal, strong, completely in command of both herself and her troubled kingdom. Like so many royals before and after her, she discovered a private remedy that allowed her to function despite unbearable circumstances. For decades, royal staff and court physicians maintained meticulous silence around Queen Anne's health, treating her composure as something too sacred for discussion. But documents and private correspondence that surfaced years after her death paint a more complete portrait of a woman whose doctors quietly prescribed barbiturates to manage anxiety, restlessness, and the creeping exhaustion that comes from perpetual performance under impossible conditions. These early sedatives, the dominant calming agents of the early 18th century, were commonly used to induce sleep, settle nerves, and in Queen Anne's specific case, sustain public function when private suffering threatened to overwhelm her capacity for royal duty. Court staff referred to her restorative drops and evening elixirs with the kind of diplomatic language that concealed as much as it revealed. One court physician, in correspondence never intended for publication, noted that the Queen's evening tonics were of the strengthening kind, though he added the careful qualifier, laced discreetly. Those closest to her understood the reality behind the euphemisms. Her ladies-in-waiting sometimes discovered her sleeping during afternoon hours, having excused herself from scheduled meetings with complaints of headaches that everyone politely accepted without question. Government ministers spoke in hushed tones about her increasingly withdrawn temperament and what they diplomatically termed mental fatigue. Her correspondence, especially her famously complicated relationship with Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough, took on an increasingly erratic quality that some historians attribute to the combined effects of physical pain, prescribed medication, and wine. The political demands of her era required a stoic monarch capable of weathering any crisis without visible emotion. Anne tried desperately to comply with these expectations. She attended religious services with unwavering dedication, sponsored theological scholarship, and avoided the flamboyant excesses that had tainted previous rulers' reputations. But behind the carefully maintained facade, reality proved far more intimate and infinitely more human. Alcohol wasn't her rebellion against royal constraint. It was her quiet companion, a way to manage the unbearable intersection of grief, expectation, and physical decline. In an era before effective antidepressants or modern pain management, wine often provided the only available relief that didn't involve medieval practices like bloodletting or the application of leeches. Unlike her successors, Anne didn't benefit from modern palace public relations machinery. Yet, even without sophisticated media management, the court proved remarkably effective at protecting her image. When she missed public engagements, official statements cited her well-documented physical ailments. When she appeared unsteady or spoke with less than perfect clarity, observers attributed these signs to fever or the effects of her chronic swelling. No mention was ever made of the glasses of brandy that may have steadied her hands or blurred the world just enough to make another state meeting survivable. Anne died at age 49, exhausted, bloated, and heavily medicated, both by her physicians and her own careful self-treatment. Official records listed the cause as complications from gout and dropsy, but behind that clinical diagnosis lay a life spent managing constant pain with the kind of quiet dependence that royal protocol would never permit anyone to acknowledge openly. And yet Anne wasn't the first royal to hide vulnerability behind ritualized excess. Just a generation before her troubled reign, another monarch known for his libertine charm had developed his own nightly ritual, one laced not only with pleasure, but with tonics, powders, and the medicinal poisons that 17th century apothecaries sold with reassuring confidence. King Charles II earned the title of Merry Monarch through decades of carefully cultivated revelry, but that merriment was never as effortless as it appeared. Behind the endless parties, countless mistresses, and candlelit masquerades lay a restless energy that never quite found peace, sustained by a daily chemical regimen designed to maintain the illusion of effortless royal vitality. Charles didn't simply indulge in the pleasures available to 17th century royalty. He relied on a steady stream of period tonics and elixirs, many laced with opium, mercury, and other early narcotics, to mask the growing physical cost of a life lived at perpetually unsustainable intensity. To his admirers, Charles represented the charming king who restored joy to English court life after the grim austerity of Puritan rule. He reintroduced music, theatre, fashion, and sophisticated flirtation into the cultural bloodstream of Restoration Britain. But to his numerous physicians, he was a patient of mounting contradictions, athletic and energetic during daylight hours, yet plagued by insomnia and trembling fatigue when darkness fell. His solution involved what court apothecaries marketed as medicinal cordials, sold in gold-trimmed bottles with reassuring names like the King's Strengthening Draught and Sovereign Water of Life. But beneath the poetic branding were ingredients that modern toxicologists would recognize as highly addictive compounds designed to artificially sustain energy while creating deeper dependence. Records from Charles's personal apothecaries reveal an astonishing pharmaceutical arsenal. Tinctures containing laudanum, an opium derivative that promised relief from everything. Tonics featuring powdered pearls and bezoars, exotic substances believed to counteract poison while providing mysterious vitality. Nightly restoratives laced with compounds that would make contemporary addiction specialists recoil in horror. These weren't casual comfort aids or occasional indulgences. They formed the backbone of his daily routine, part placebo, part poison, part absolutely necessary coping mechanism for a king trying to maintain impossible standards of royal performance. While Charles rarely showed weakness during public appearances, his private correspondence with court physicians tells a dramatically different story. Persistent headaches, chronic fatigue, chest tightness, periods of profound melancholy, and occasional paralysis in his extremities. His health problems weren't always visible to courtiers and subjects, but they were constant, and they were treated with the full chemical arsenal that Restoration-era medicine could provide. His dependence on medicinal stimulants and sedatives wasn't particularly unusual among 17th century aristocracy. What made Charles unique was how seamlessly this chemical support system was woven into his carefully constructed public image. While his father, Charles I, had been remembered as solemn and ultimately tragic, Charles II reinvented monarchy as an ongoing celebration of life itself. He threw elaborate balls during constitutional crises. He made jokes during tense parliamentary debates. He maintained his reputation as a tireless lover and patron of arts even when his body began showing signs of serious rebellion. When physical decline threatened his performance, he simply increased the dosage and continued the show. The supreme irony of his reign was that many of the same physicians who supplied these chemical supports would later scramble desperately to save him from their long-term effects. In his final weeks, Charles suffered what was officially described as a sudden illness, likely a stroke that may have been worsened by decades of strain and substance exposure. Royal physicians bled him, purged him, blistered his skin, and dosed him with additional compounds in a full spectrum of 17th century treatments that read now like a slow-motion medical disaster. Contemporary accounts suggest he died surrounded by alchemists and astrologers, with jars of powdered amber and opium tinctures within easy reach. To the public, he remained the merry monarch until his final breath, generous, charming, and gone far too soon. The carefully managed rituals of medicine had been successfully disguised as natural vitality, and the gradual breakdown occurring beneath the crown was never fully revealed to his subjects. Still, Charles wasn't the only royal to masterfully balance both personal vice and public image. One of his own nephews would inherit not just political power, but also a dangerous appetite for risk. A man whose gambling debts were quietly forgiven by Parliament, whose nightly excesses were diplomatically edited from official records, and whose various addictions left far more than just financial receipts in their wake. Prince Frederick, Duke of York, may be immortalized in nursery rhymes as the general who marched his men up the hill only to march them down again. But his real legacy runs far deeper and considerably darker than children's verses suggest. He was King George III's second son, Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, and the architect of military reforms that shaped Britain's defence capabilities for generations. He was also, behind closed palace doors, a compulsive gambler and heavy drinker whose appetite for risk extended far beyond battlefield strategy into the treacherous realm of cards, dice, and expensive wine. To the British public, Frederick embodied military respectability, calm under pressure, strategically competent, disciplined in all his official duties. But behind the scenes, he harboured a weakness for gambling that went far beyond the casual card games common among Georgian aristocracy. Frederick played with the desperate intensity of a man trying to fill some indefinable void, often losing sums that would have bankrupted lesser mortals. Of course, bankruptcy is a relative concept when you're funded by British taxpayers and shielded by the impenetrable armour of royal privilege. Still, his debts accumulated with terrifying speed. Contemporary correspondence from increasingly anxious creditors, intercepted court documents, and whispered conversations among fellow officers reveal a man living in perpetual financial freefall, borrowing frequently, repaying slowly, and requiring direct parliamentary intervention on more than one occasion to prevent complete financial collapse. Not publicly, Naturally, such interventions happened behind carefully closed doors through delicate negotiations and strategically worded financial rearrangements. Royal dignity demanded preservation, even when drowning in debt accumulated through compulsive self-destruction. The alcohol didn't help his decision-making process. Frederick's relationship with drink wasn't particularly scandalous by 18th century aristocratic standards, but it was remarkably consistent, bordering on ritualistic dependency. He drank to celebrate victories, to forget defeats, to prepare for difficult meetings, often continuing well past midnight after exhausting evenings of gambling or demanding court engagements. Friends who survived him later noted his visibly declining health and increasingly frequent absences from official duties, but loyalty prevented honest discussion. The Duke was, after all, royal blood. His habits weren't treated as dangerous problems requiring intervention. They were simply accepted as colourful personality traits that added character to his otherwise distinguished military service. The carefully maintained facade occasionally cracked under pressure. One of the most public fractures came during the Mary Ann Clark scandal, a widely publicised affair in which Frederick's former mistress was accused of illegally selling army commissions, allegedly with his knowledge, or at least his willful blindness, to her activities. The scandal nearly destroyed his carefully constructed reputation. Though he vehemently denied any involvement, the press seized the opportunity to dissect his private life with unprecedented scrutiny. He was temporarily forced to resign his military position while investigations proceeded. His gambling and drinking habits were never cited directly as contributing factors, but biographers have long noted how his personal chaos may have made him more vulnerable to manipulation by those with sharper instincts and fewer scruples. Despite the temporary disgrace, Frederick eventually returned to public service and died with his military reputation largely restored. History chooses to remember him as the army reformer, the dedicated royal uncle, the man who professionalised British defence systems and prepared the nation for the conflicts that would define the 19th century. His private dependencies were carefully edited from official records like footnotes no one dared read aloud. But Frederick's story, like so many royal narratives, serves as a reminder that beneath every uniform and ceremonial title lived a human being, struggling, often unsuccessfully, to manage pressures that would have crushed ordinary mortals. Just as Frederick reached for wine and cards to navigate the impossible demands of royal military service, another monarch, ruling a vast empire from behind the black veil of perpetual mourning, reached for something far more potent. A chemical solution to grief and numbness, carefully packaged in dark bottles labelled with reassuring medical terminology. Queen Victoria ruled for over 60 years, presiding over an empire so geographically vast that the sun literally never set on British territories. She became the living embodiment of dutiful widowhood, national stability, and imperial resolve that seemed to transcend ordinary human limitations. But beneath the jet-black mourning dresses and austere public proclamations was a woman quietly medicating herself through decades of grief that would have shattered anyone less determined to maintain appearances. To understand her hidden dependency, one must first comprehend the magnitude of her loss. When Prince Albert died in 1861, Victoria didn't simply enter mourning in the performative royal sense. She underwent a complete psychological retreat from the world of the living. She wore unrelenting black for the remaining 40 years of her life, withdrew almost entirely from public appearances for several years, and instructed palace staff to maintain Albert's private rooms exactly as he had left them, as if he might return at any moment. And so we reach the end of our journey through the shadowed halls of royal dependency, where crowns couldn't cure human frailty and divine right offered no protection against the quiet demons that lurked behind palace walls. From George IV's laudanum-soaked evenings to Victoria's grief-numbed solitude, these 30 souls remind us that even those born to rule were never immune to the need for relief, for escape, for something to make the unbearable weight of expectation just a little more manageable. Perhaps that's the most human truth of all, that behind every carefully constructed facade, every airbrushed portrait, every perfectly choreographed public appearance, there lived people who simply needed help getting through another day. Sweet dreams, and may your own rest be more peaceful than theirs ever was.